Likutei Sichos, Chelik Tezvav, volume 15, the fifth Sicha for Parshas Vayishlach. This is a Rashi Sicha with a very interesting explanation from Chassidus at the end. It would be worthwhile to go over the psukim, the verses in the beginning of Parshas Toldos, which describe the birth and the difference between Yaakov and Esav. Over there, the prophet says to Rivka, Shnei goyim bevitnech. There are two nations in your womb. Ushnei le'umim mima'ayich yipraeru. And two nations, two nationalities, will split from your womb. Ula'oim mila'oim yemotz. And one nation will be stronger, will be more powerful than the other nation. However, v'rav yavoid tzoyer. The older one will always serve the younger one. Now over there, the word goyim is spelled without the vav. So it could also be read gayim, which means great people. And Rashi says that this is a reference to the two great people, one from the descendants of Esav from Edom, that's Rome, and the other one, a descendant, of course, of Yaakov. Both of them are Antoninus and the famous great Tana Rabbi Yehuda HaKadosh. So let's get into the Sicha. So in the end of our Parsha, it lists over there, quote, all the Mlachim, all the kings that ruled for the nation of Edom, for the descendants of Esav, Lifnei Meloich Melech Vnei Yisrael, prior to there ever being a king to the children of Yisrael, the children of Yaakov. One of them, in the list of the kings, is Yovav ben Zarach mi Botzra. Yovav, the son of Zarach from Botzra. So Rashi comments on these words, Yovav ben Zarach mi Botzra, and he says, Botzra is from the cities of Moav, as it says, Val Kroyos Va'al Botzra. This is a verse which describes the downfall of Edom, and in the list of the various cities that are going to be afflicted by Hashem at the end of time, when Hashem brings down punishment over Edom for what they've done to the children of Israel, over there he lists Kroyes and Botzra, but these are from the cities of Moav. So Rashi proves that Botzra is from Moav. And Rashi continues, since it provided a king for the nation of Edom, therefore it's going to be afflicted together with them, as it says, Ki zevach Hashem beBotzra, that there will be, so to speak, a celebration for Hashem in Botzra at the end of days when Hashem will wreak punishment on Edom, and including with them will be Botzra. So the question is, why does Rashi have to explain this at all? In other words, what is this relevant to us to know that Botzra is actually not from Edom, but rather from Moav? That Yoav's descendant, that his pedigree was from Botzra, not from Edom. There are those commentaries that explain that the reason that compelled Rashi to do so is in order to explain to us why it says that Yoav was from Botzra. And therefore Rashi explains this. However, this explanation is problematic. Why? Because this in itself is questionable. What point is there? Why do we have to know this? That it's going to be afflicted together with them, quote unquote. That Botzra is going to be punished alongside Edom. What value does this have for Pshutei Shel Mikra? And number two, and this is the main question, by all the kings of Edom, in the entire list of the kings of Edom, it all names, by each one of them, it names their descent and where they're from. And Rashi doesn't say anything. Rashi doesn't comment anything at all. And therefore it's understood that from the perspective of Pshat, of Pshutei Shel Mikra, there's no question at all. There's no need to know why they were named from the place they were named from. In other words, why the Pasuk made it a point to tell us where the descent was from, because Rashi doesn't comment anything. So the question comes back to the original question, why here? Why does Rashi find it necessary to explain this to us and to tell us that they'll be afflicted together with Edom, but that Yovav indeed was not from Edom, rather he was from elsewhere? So in order to understand this, we have to actually explain something which goes back to an earlier verse in an earlier parsha, which explains the difference and the greatness of in the pedigree of Edom versus Yisrael, the descendants of Esav versus the descendants of Yaakov. In the verse it says, Shnei goyim bevitnech. There are two nations in your womb, Ushnei le'umim ima'ayich yiparedu, and two peoples, two nations will separate from your womb. Ula'oim mila'oim yemotz, and one people shall be mightier than the other. However, v'rav yavet tzoyer, but the greater one, meaning the older one, will always serve the younger one. So on the words ula'oim mila'oim yemotz, Rashi explains, what does that mean? That one nation, will always be stronger than the other nation. So Rashi explains that it means that they will never be equal in greatness, meaning these two nations that will come out from your womb, this is what's being told to Rivka, they will never be equal in their stature. When one falls, one will rise. When the other falls, then this one will rise. However, on the words, V'rav Yavoit Soyer, that the younger one will always serve, the older one will always serve the younger one, Rashi doesn't explain anything at all. And of course, the obvious question is, how does this fit in the previous clause of the verse? The previous clause of the verse, Rashi clearly explains that it's telling us that one will be greater. When one will be greater, the other will fall. When the other will fall, the other will be greater. So how does this consistent? How do we reconcile this with the end of the verse that always, absolutely always, there will be a fact that the older one will worship the younger one? The answer is that on the words Shnei Goyim, which, like we mentioned in the introduction, is spelled without a vav, which can also be read Shnei Goyim, two great people, Rashi explains that this is a reference to Antoninus and Rebbe, that it's talking about the two individuals, and that Shnei Le'umin, Rashi says, this means Malchius, this means kingdoms. And this is not just merely, so to speak, being repeated for poetic effect, but rather it's talking about two different things. Shnei Goyim is talking about Yaakov and Esav and their descendants as individuals, as people. Whereas Le'um, Shnei Le'umim, two nations, this is talking about them as nations. Yaakov and Esav as kingdoms. And according to this, it's understood. These are two different things the verse is telling us. As far as the two kingdoms are concerned, La'oim mila'oim yemotz, that is indeed the fact that when one rises, the other will fall. As far as, however, the individuals, the Shnei Goyim bevitnech, that will always consistently be, without fail, V'rav Yavoit Tzoyer, that the older one will always serve the younger one. This is going to be a continuous, constant thing. And this, in fact, helps us understand why when Esav came in crying and said, please, Father, give me a blessing, some blessing, and Yitzchak said to him, I can't help you. He has been established as the Rav, as the greater one, and therefore you're established now as the younger one. There's nothing I can do for you. You are going to be his servant forever, indefinitely. But according to this, we have a question. In other words, this is where the reason for Rashi's explanation here in our verse comes to light. In other words, this is the source of the problem, why Rashi felt compelled that he has to explain. The question is, over here we have a whole list of all the kings of Edom, all the kings that were crowned for Edom generation after generation, and as it says, Lifnei Meloich Melech Yisrael, prior to the fact that there was ever an established king for the children of Israel. So the question, and then when there was a king for the children of Israel, the whole entire kingship, the whole monarchy, the whole succession of monarchy for Edom was abolished. So the question is, because of this verse, V'rav Yaveh Tzoyer, that the older one will worship the younger one, the question is, how is it possible that there were in fact kings from Edom? When according to this edict, according to this decree of Rav Yaveh Tzoyer, none of them should have ever rise to greatship. None of them should ever rise to kingship. So therefore, the verse makes a point to indicate the place of origin of each king, to make it clear, to make it obvious that not one of these kings of Edom originated in Edom. Each one of them was a transplant from elsewhere. Each one of them was not an individual that was a descendant from Esau, and therefore the fact that they rose to greatship, that is not a contradiction, that is not in contrast to this idea of Verav Yavai Tzoyer, that the older one will worship the younger one, because none of them ever rose to kingship. However, when it comes to Yovav, this particular king, who is from Botzra, over here there's a question, because the verse names him as Yovav ben Zorach, the son of Zorach. Now we do find in the Alufei Esau, in the list of the heads of the clans and the heads of the families, the descendants of Esau, we do find the Zorach. So there may be some indication that this Yovav is the son of that Zorach. And if that's the case, then we would go back to the question, how is it possible that he rose to greatship when it says Verav Yavai Tzoyer? And another question, many places we find Botzra, the city of his origin, in association with Edom, in close association with Edom. And therefore we would seem to imply that he is indeed a direct descendant of Esau. That's what compelled Rashi to explain that this Botzra is not a place of Edom. This Botzra actually, although it's many times associated with Edom, but in fact it is from Moab, from a totally different nation. But because they're going to be afflicted, they're going to be punished alongside with Edom, therefore they become typically associated with Edom, but they're not in Edom. They're not from Edom. So this now helps us understand why Rashi felt compelled to explain it and what is the purpose of this explanation. This is to point out that this is consistent with the list that none of the kings of Edom were indeed from Edom, but rather they were all from elsewhere, transplants from other nations. Now, however, we need to understand in this idea that we said before, Verav Yavai Tzoyer, that the older one will worship the younger one. The older one will always be subservient to the younger one, meaning Esau will always be subservient to Yaakov, and this applies to all times without fail. The question is now on something totally separate. How is it that in the beginning of our Parsha, Yaakov sends a message to Esau, and he says to the messengers, tell Esau, Koi soimrum la'adoni le'Esau. So you should say to my master, to Esau. And what should you tell him? Koi omar avdecha Yaakov. So says your servant Yaakov. In other words, this is the exact opposite of Verav Yavai Tzoyer, that the older one should serve the younger one. Here Yaakov is subserviating himself to Esau. Now, as far as the pshat is concerned, we can answer this, and we can say, look, remember Yaakov was fearful that perhaps he was not deserving of all Hashem's kindness, right? If he said, Kontointi mikol hachasodim, he says, I feel so inadequate and so small from all the kindness you have done to me. And like Rashi says, he was concerned, Shema yigre machet. Maybe the sin will causes it so that I am not deserving of all the kindness of Hashem. So perhaps you can apply that here too, that he felt that maybe because of the sin, he is not deserving of the fulfillment of this promise that was given to his mother of Verav Yavai Tzoyer. Okay, so according to Pshat, we could answer this away. However, the Medrash says that the fact that Yaakov made himself subservient to Esau in this verse, that he said, he called Esau his master, and he referred to himself as the servant of Esau, in fact, he was punished for this. But we can understand that this doesn't mean literally that Yaakov sinned, because we know that Yaakov, alongside, as well as all the other Avos, were all considered a Merkava, to godliness, like a chariot, so to speak, to Hashem, that they didn't have a will of their own, and whatever they did was an absolute consistent and absolutely in line with Hashem's will. So how do we explain it? That on the one hand, Yaakov Avinu does this, and the Medrash says that he was quote-unquote punished. There was some so to speak, some retribution for this. There was a price to pay for this. But on the other hand, that Yaakov was not in any way sinful for having done so. So the Rebbe says that in Chassidus it's explained that really the shoydish of Esav, meaning the Esav, the point from where Esav descends, meaning the source in heaven, in the spiritual realms, Esav is actually greater. Esav is actually higher than Yaakov. And that actually explains why Esav was born first. However, when Yaakov, therefore, when Yaakov is able to be mevarer, he's able to cleanse, so to speak, he's able to elevate the aspect of Esav, then the great light of Esav, meaning he's able to tap into the source of Esav, from where he really comes in the spiritual realm, then he's able to bring out this great, tremendous spiritual light, which overpowers and overwhelms the actual manifestation of Esav in this world, which is bad. And with this we could understand why Yaakov sent the message that he sent to Esav. He was not sending it to Esav in his manifestation here in this world. He was sending it to Esav, he was sending it to the shoydish of Esav, to the source of Esav, to the high level from which Esav originally descends from, that is indeed greater than his own. And indeed there he is subservient to it because he is of a lower level. He comes from a lower level. However, we need to understand then why was he punished? If he was doing the right thing, what kind of punishment or what kind of negative result could there be from this, when in fact this is a good thing, this is the case? The answer is as follows. In the victory of the good over bad, meaning in the process of defeating the bad, the darkness of the world, there are two modes. There are two ways to achieve this. There are two ways to accomplish this. One way is by a gilui or, by revealing such an immense light, that meaning the mevarer, the person who seeks to elevate the bad, shines, so to speak, reveals such a great, tremendous spiritual light, such a great spiritual energy, that the bad dissolves, that the bad becomes, so to speak, pushed away. In other words, you don't get directly involved with the bad. You don't get down to the bad's level, but from where you are, from where you're perched, so to speak, in this high spiritual realm, you shine down a very strong light and it overwhelms the dark. That's one manner. Another manner of doing it is in a way, in the Chassidus it's called b'derech hislapshus, by getting, so to speak, directly involved. That the mevarer, the one who's seeking to elevate the bad, actually goes down, so to speak, to the place of the misbarer of that object, of that person, of that thing that he's trying to elevate. And therefore, you have to lower yourself to, quote, the place of darkness. Now, each one of these two has an advantage on the other. When you say, from the perspective of the person who's doing the work, it's obvious that the first mode is superior. Why? Because in this case, he doesn't have to lower himself. He doesn't have to get directly involved in the dark. He doesn't have to get directly entangled with the bad, because he is perched from his high place and he's just shining a very strong light. Like the words of the Alter Rebbe in Tanya, where he says that if somebody has a tug of war with a dirty person, with a bad person, you also, without any other option, you also tend to get dirtied. In other words, you tend to get soiled. So therefore, this has an advantage when you are from a distance, so to speak. You're not getting directly involved. You're not going in direct contact with the bad. However, when you look at it from the other hand, the other mode has a tremendous advantage, meaning from the perspective of the thing that you're elevating, or the person you're elevating, when you get directly involved, when the good goes down to the bad and gets directly entrenched with the bad, then when it's effective, the bad itself becomes transformed. You see, in the first mode, in the first option, the bad doesn't really get transformed, it just gets pushed away. Whereas in this option, it actually becomes elevated, it becomes transformed, and mission becomes fully accomplished. The ultimate purpose of Torah mitzvahs is, quote, lasois shalom ba'olam, to bring about Shalom, peace in the world. What is peace? When you take two opposites and you bring them together. That's where you need peace. The world itself, olam, is a helem, is a concealment of godliness, right? That represents the darkness, the bad. And we need the Torah and mitzvahs are here for us to bring quote unquote peace to the world, that the concealment on godliness should actually transform and become a helpful party in the revelation of godliness. And since, where do we see this? We see the Torah itself. As the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that Nasa v'yorda lamata, the Torah itself, so to speak, traveled to a great distance and it lowered itself down here into this world. And as it says in the Pasuk, Hashem describes this situation in the verse that it says, Kol malbushai egalti, that all my garments, so to speak, I have soiled. And it's interesting, in this word egalti, you also hear a sounding of the word geula, which actually is connected, that Hashem says, so to speak, I lowered my Shekhinah, I lowered my Torah into the world, and I allowed it, so to speak, to become somewhat soiled by getting involved in the darkness and the bad of the world, in order for it to eventually achieve egalti, that we should be able to totally redeem them and bring about the geula. Just like Hashem does it, of course, as we know, tzaddikim doimim leboiram. The tzaddikim are very similar, quote, to their creator. That just like Hashem chose to do this, so too they choose to go down, to lower themselves, so to speak, into the darkness in order to bring about, in order to achieve a total transformation of the bad, and therefore to bring about the geula, to bring the geula closer. And the ultimate transformation of Esav will be when Esav will eventually admit and agree to this idea